Yeah, there you go.
Better? All right. Anyway, so EPA's website's where I'm pulling the current versions of the models that that I use when I'm using these models. So I guess the two again that I'm focusing on are AgDisp and AgDrift. Those are you that are maybe are aware kind of what's going on internationally. There are a few other things in development. I know there's a couple of groups that are looking to develop more CFD-based physics models that at this point are not quite ready and are quite difficult to use computationally. There's another couple ones that are some lookup models that are out there, but in terms of the regulatory use of modeling for doing pesticide spray drift, AgDisp and AgDrift are the two primary ones. And I guess if you're not familiar with AgDisp, AgDrift, and hopefully I'm not overgoing ground that most people are familiar with, but really the power of these models is a fairly extensive understanding and development of how vortex fields work on aircraft. This work was developed, I mean, back in the 70s and 80s for commercial airliners. And what it allows the ability to do is, if you can kind of see this picture off to the side, but it provides for an understanding of how the flow field from an aircraft is acting on spray droplets of a given size. So it gives a relationship of when these droplets are released from the aircraft and enter this vortex field, where do they end up relative to their size and the surrounding conditions before they're released from the influence of the aircraft. And then there's some more basic modeling that goes into where they are delivered. So this understanding of this wake effect and the body effect of how the spray droplets being released from the platform travel relative to the platform after the platform leaves and then downwind from the platform is really what makes the aerial part of AgDisp and AgDrift so powerful and has something that's been documented and improved and updated over the last couple of decades. So that's really the power of these models, is this understanding of this wake field in addition to some of the other things they've added to it. So if you've not seen AgDisp, originally it was developed back in the 80s for the Forest Service. The primary work, or I guess the primary drive for this work was understanding forest sprays, how they interacted with the canopy, what happened when they were released from the aircraft, and it has grown since then. But one of the things you'll see when you open up the model or open up AgDisp to the default screen, you'll start seeing some parameters in here that if you're used to row crop spraying, that you kind of scratch your head on. You look over to the surface and you see this canopy height of 70 feet, which ought to sort of raise a flag real quick that that's not what we're looking at in terms of ag spraying. That's obviously a canopy spray. So there's just a couple of things in there that it defaults just because this was originally a forestry or U.S. Forest Service based model that they've got it defaulted to that. So there's some parameters in here that need to be changed. But again, within AgDisp, you've got the ability to go in and change your nozzle type. And I got this one right now actually set on, because I wanted to show that this is AgDisp. It's off the EPA's website. It's 8.26, I think, which is the last one that had the ground model built into it. So you can see in the this application method box, you've got this method box you can pull down that will switch between ground and air. So this version still has the ground model. The latest updates in AgDisp, that was removed. So that's why this one's still up on the regulatory website. It's the one being used. But again, it gives you the ability to change a bunch of different parameters relative to what's going on. And then there's some deeper stuff in there that you can really monkey around with and mess things up if you're not careful. So looking at where AgDisp came from, and I guess it's kind of good to know where all of this came from, is after, or as part of the development and part of the motivation for the development goes back to, again, the 90s, where there was a recognition that that the data requirements for registration through EPA in terms of the risk assessment process was going to be much more involved. And there was a whole conglomerate of industry that got together and formed what I think most people are familiar with, which is the Spray Drift Task Force. And they came together as an entity and were able to do some fairly large scale ground, aerial, and air blast studies that developed quite an extensive library of drift and deposition curves. And those are still what are driving the ag drift model. And again, there's some limitations, obviously, when you start talking about this. When you look at what ag drift is the two, ag disp and ag drift were sort of developed hand in hand. You've got ag disp for the aerial model within ag drift, but when you look at the ground and orchard air blast functions within ag drift, they're really primarily modeled to curve fits from Spray Drift Task Force data and a few other data sets that have been generated since then to be acceptable. So ag drift is a different approach to the modeling. You've got 3 tiers where it's sort of a worst case to best case scenario, where tier 1 would be the most simple setup. You don't really have much ability to change anything. With the ground and the orchard, you can basically change boom height and droplet size, or orchard type with the orchard air blast. So it's really limited to that field collected data and the fits that are on that data, even though there are some efforts to try to keep growing that model to more of an empirical physical model. It's not quite there yet because we don't have, again, the understanding like we do from the aircraft. When you look at the aerial on ag drift, this is one that was pulled from a user manual off of an old user manual from ag drift, where it shows that this tier 1 and tier 2 aerial are not available in the public version. Well, this is outdated. If you go to that website and download ag drift from EPA's website, the current one that you use actually has a tier 1 and tier 2 as well as the tier 3. Where tier 1, again, is a very limited set of parameters that you can change. You have a few more you can change with tier 2. And then tier 3, in theory, is basically like working in ag disp, where you have full control over all the parameters. That's not necessarily true, because I'm not sure what the last version of ag disp that was updated into ag drift is, but I'm not sure it's the current one that's being used regulatory-wise. But it might be. So ag drift, when you open it up, you have these tiers, and it looks a lot like ag disp because it was developed by the same folks and on the same platform. You have the various tiers that you can go into, and once you select that, it opens up the parameters that you can change, and then access to the different toolboxes where you can do ground deposition assessments, stream assessments, all the fun stuff that the regulatory process demands. So one of the challenges with, I guess, sort of quote unquote state-of-the-art models at this point is we're really limited on the ground boom modeling and to an extent the orchard air blast, where we have, like I mentioned back at the beginning, a very, very well documented and mature understanding of all of the wake fields and all of the physical things going on around the aircraft and how they influence the spray being released from them until they finally get to sort of an ambient control of the ambient air. With the ground boom and orchard air blast platforms, we don't have that same level of actual physical model that we can use. Again, it's more curve driven at this point. There are, like I said, efforts to start expanding either these curves or our understanding of the physical models built into the ground and air blast models, but we're still not there, and we don't have the advantage like was back in the early 90s, where you had this industry task force that was funneling a significant level of funding into doing this work. As it stands now, this is fairly limited number of folks that are out there actually conducting trials like were done in the day of the Spray Drift Task Force in order to generate these curves. More recently, here within the last couple of years and before Harold Thistle, who had been basically the driver behind AgDisp and the updates, left Forest Service, there was a final update to the sort of open source available AgDisp to a version 9.0. There were a few improvements on some evaporation model in there that needed some adjusting on how it dealt with cloud effect and time steps. A better forest canopy structure evaluation, added in a far field extension for some more of the long-term, particularly vector control modeling, updated the droplet size databases that are used in driving the modeling inputs. And then this says updates to Tier 1 ground and orchard assessments, and that's true, but those are not actually in where you can access them in the UI of the model. And I think those were taken out because there were, I think frankly, there were some misuses of how those tiers and how you could add curves to it were being used. So that's something that I don't know where the future of this is at. This is one of those things that we've, over the past several months, and even here in a couple of weeks, we've got meetings trying to figure out. The reality is these things need constant updating, if nothing else, to fit with modern and changing computer program structures. And then just as new things are learned and research happens, adding these improvements to it. And without the Forest Service sort of sponsoring the model like it did, we're in a place where there's not hardline funding for this. There's not really a centralized group to drive this. So it's one of the challenges moving forward that we're trying to figure out what and how these things live, and ultimately who's going to take the lead, or who as a group are going to take the lead in keeping these things as a viable resource. I will say that 9.0 has been sent to EPA, but again, for those of you that are in the regulatory arena, it's not as easy as here's a new model and they'll start using it. There's a lot of really cross-checking with current models and how assessments agree and don't agree before anything ever gets used officially. So this is one of those that there's kind of a bit of an uncertainty where or when this one will ever be integrated into the regulatory environment. And again, I'm not speaking for EPA. I can't speak for EPA, but this is just sort of my impression of where things are at. Again, this is another one of my interpretations of where things are at in terms of how these models are used regulatory-wise. In a number of calls and meetings and stuff I've been in the past several years, it's fairly apparent that even though AgDisp, which is a more advanced aerial model, is available and can be used, the first step in most of these assessments is AgDrift, and probably the Tier 1, because it's the most defendable, I guess I would say, in terms of what's the potential worst case. So when you're regular or looking to do assessments to protect the environment first and foremost, really that worst case assessment's the place to start. So that's been one of those things that there are some things related to worst case that can always be improved, and particularly considering what industry standard best management practices are. So there's been some discussions that I know have gone on, that a few I've been a part of with our regulatory folks, on how can we either relax, adjust, or work within the assumptions of some of these modeling inputs to better reflect what's actually being done out in the field. And again, that's always a hard conversation on both sides, I know, because there's two different objectives. So that's one it's always an interesting conversation to have, and it really helps drive some understanding forward. But anyway, that's always a fun process. And then that's that's what I had prepared. Again, I didn't want to get into just running models and stuff, because that frankly gets kind of boring. So I guess I'll pause there and see how.
Brad, this is Jeff. Do you know where we can access that version 9.0 of AgDisp?
Me. If you'll send me, while I'm answering, I'll put my email in the chat. If you'll send me an email, I can send you the install files.
Ah, great, thanks.
Hey Brad, this is Steve Hansen at Forest Protection on the east coast of Canada. One, good presentation. Two, I'm not sure if you're aware or not, but we happen to be sitting on a wind tunnel with the ability to measure droplet size and spray.
Yep.
And we also are the founders of SURGE, which is the Spray Efficacy Research Group. And we got some unspent research dollars. Why don't we connect afterwards, and we might be able to help you with some of this stuff.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's been 8 or 10 years since I've been involved in any meaningful way with that SURGE group. And I mean, I know your guys are one of those places I've always had a goal to get up and visit, and just hadn't made it. But yeah, anything that we can do to work together on any of this, I'm absolutely would be more than open to.
Awesome. Sounds good. Thanks.
Brad, I don't know if you've seen in the chat, somebody, Edward Lang, asked if there was any updates to Dropkick.
Not that I'm aware of. I don't know that work has been updating in any meaningful way in a long time. I mentioned one of the updates, I think even prior to that 9.0 version of AgDisp, and I know it's in 9.0, is that our group has also within the last 6, 7, 8, 9 years, did a pretty significant update on all of the droplet size models that are for, I guess, the most common use rotary wing and fixed wing nozzles or aircraft nozzles. And those models got added into AgDisp. So those updated USDA ARS droplet sizing models are actually in the current version of AgDisp, which it's not really an update to Dropkick, because I know Dropkick addressed more of the tank mix stuff and some of the other, but that's something we're working toward as well. But as far as I know, Dropkick hasn't had a meaningful update since the version that it's in now. And if somebody out there knows different, please correct me. I'm happy to be corrected.
Hi, Brad. This is JD Wall from PMRA. Yeah, thank you very much for that presentation. Really appreciated the context too around the development of the models and where they're headed. And I understand that you touched on the CFD models, and they're not really ready for development or presentation yet. But can you expand on that a little bit for us? We're not really too familiar with the CFD mechanisms and what the differences are between that and what we've got with AgDisp right now.
So the CFD approach is a totally different, where AgDisp has some physical model in place. And it, like I said, I showed on that first slide, it has an understanding with relation to the aircraft of what those vortex fields look like, or at least a simplified version of what those vortex fields look like and how droplets behave relative to them. The model is built on some, I'm going to say this, and I don't mean simplified to mean they're simple, but simplified relative to what a full physics fluids-based modeling approach would take. It's a very simplified set of governing equations that allow for, kind of keeping track of and modeling how these droplets move relative to those vortex streams, and then where they ultimately get released off into the ambient environment. And from there, they go off into some fairly simple dispersion modeling. The CFD approach is really taking the whole system and looking at it as one large fluid simulation where you're, looking at the whole structure and modeling everything that's going on. So I'm speaking as less than a novice fluids modeler on this, because it's a very, very, the programs and the software and the assumptions that go into just setting up even a simple, very simple, like a single body and fluids around it and modeling that is very, very difficult and can really lead to whatever you want to, depending on how you set the model up. So the efforts that I know of, I know there's a couple internationally. Actually, I want to say that there was I don't think it was through FPL, but I know there were some CFD models of some rotary atomizers that was done up in that wind tunnel with Gordon and Ian a number of years ago. But as far as I know, none of those are to the point of being ready for use. And even if they were to actually run these things, a very simple CFD model, I've been working with a graduate student that's looking at nozzles from CFD standpoint. So he sets the model up. It's a very basic nozzle structure. It's running this thing for hours in order to get the answer. So, running this on, I'm a government employee, so I can say this, but running this on your stock, basic, cheap off the government list computers that you can actually use trying to run a CFD program is not, when you have to do a bunch of these, it's not something that's going to happen. There was an effort by a guy named Herping Zhu out of the USDA ARS lab in Worcester, where he was looking at, I think it was orchard sprayers, where he had some students actually run a bunch of these CFD runs on looking at how this, from an orchard sprayer and with varying different orchard structures, what happens drift wise. And then they took, thousands and thousands and thousands of these simulations and basically took the data and developed a curve fit approach. So they used CFD to develop the equivalent of what it would go out in the field and measure this stuff, and then fit it into a model that was basically a curve fit model so that it was something that was easy to run. So I think that at some point down the road, unless computer technology advances and training on these things advances, I think that's where that would ultimately go to, is somebody would develop this large scale runnable, I guess, something that you could check and make sure it works, and then develop a curve fit based on these more, more advanced modeling approaches. But I still think that's a ways off. It's AgDisp, depending on what you're running, can still take a few seconds or a minute, which is, a decade in computer time. So there's always the trade-offs between, the much more advanced physical approaches to where we are with the models now. That was a long answer for what you asked, but that was sort of my understanding of where the CFD stuff is at. There's efforts that are out there to try to do that for the big data gaps in the ground boom sprayers and orchard sprayers.
No, that's great. I appreciate that. Thank you, Brad.
We got another one here, Brad. It says, have you utilized the multiple application assessment module for AgDisp?
Not to any meaningful extent. I know there's been some discussions on that as something to help sort of mitigate some of the worst case assessments, where you can actually look at these applications over time. But that's just not something that comes up. Again, my use of these models tends to be more from using it in a research role and not from the regulatory side of things, which is where this would actually better fit. So I'm not, I've run it, but not in any way that I would remember being able to provide any meaningful feedback.
Okay, any more questions for Brad? Okay, if not, I guess if there's anything else you have, Brad, for us, or that's where we're at?
Yeah, like I said, sorry this was not more extensive. I just wasn't sure. So if there's any other questions or anything, feel free to contact me. The other thing I'll throw out there is one of the things that has gone through we've got a little group of us that have at one point in time either stewarded or been part of stewarding AgDisp, is working toward this thought of how do we keep something that is this unique resource and a very valuable resource, how do we keep it as something that's valuable moving forward, and trying to address the issues and concerns of, not just leaving the model stagnant as we move forward, because then it becomes where we're using, and we already are with the current version, something that's 6 or 8 years old. And so how do we do that? And so that's something we've been working with. And one of the things that is making it challenging because there's a number of groups, both commercial and private, that have a pretty significant interest in using all the underlying source code, basically, of AgDisp to help better integrate into some of the technologies and decision management tools we have with our application systems. I guess I'm kind of thinking specifically of, we've had a number of conversations when we look at the aerial platform, that right now on most aircraft that are out there, we have GPS systems, we have flow control systems, some have onboard weather systems, telemetry systems. We have all the inputs into the model, basically. And there's really no reason that we don't have what we need to take what is a very advanced model and have this sort of running real time as a real-time tracking, if you will, of drift. And what's the ultimate drift control is if you're sort of monitoring it and tracking it real time, it can ultimately, I always vision a red light of, the model exceeds some threshold of model drift, and you hit a red light, and that tells whoever the applicator is, all right, maybe I'll wait until conditions change, or change something that I'm doing. But one of the challenges we have with that is the current source code is fairly convoluted, and for those of you familiar with Microsoft Visual Basic and Fortran, it's in a combination of those, which is, as you can imagine, not very easy to go into and use in not easy to use, frankly. So we've got a few efforts out there really trying to find a way to reformat that source code into something that can be more useful to folks out there beyond just the little, outdated square box you look at with the pull down button. So that's an ongoing effort that we haven't had much progress, but I'll just throw it out there that I've got several versions of AgDisp where I actually have the source code. So if there's amateur hardcore computer programmers or whatever out there that might be interested in that, again, send me an email and I'd be happy to share that with you. That any more brains that are thinking about this to try to figure out how to make something like that that's more useful, the better. But that's something that I definitely have available and would be happy to share.
We got another question here, Brad. Any basic producers looking at DST relative to droplet formation size and flight characteristic?
What's DST?
I'm not 100% sure.
Dynamic surface tension.
There we go.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I don't know about the flight characteristics, but I've certainly looked at that from the aerial atomization side of things before. We're looking at, dynamic surface tension, viscosity, several different physical parameters related to how that relates to droplet formation. There's been a couple other folks I know over the last year or so have put forth some fairly extensive projects, really trying to grow some larger data sets. We're looking at a much broader range of nozzle types, solution types, and just developing these large sort of meta databases that we can look at some more of the advanced statistical analysis approaches to see if we can get a better understanding of that. But in terms of the flight characteristics, I'm not aware of anything specific on that relative to the dynamic surface tension.
What were you thinking about, Edward? What was on your mind?
Taking a look at the different AIs and how they influence the different surface tensions, and also looking at the relative evaporation depending upon the climate that the system is being used in.
There's been a bit of work. I know Herping and Wooster, the pesticide application group in North Platte, Nebraska, and a few others have done some work looking at trying to better understand the evaporation potential with some of these different, multiple partner tank mixes and their physical properties, where some of those are at this point in terms of actually integrating them into, data sets or models that are usable in, something like a spray drift model. I'm not sure.
Thank you, Brad.
Uh-huh.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, guys, for the questions for Brad. That was excellent. Definitely learned some new. I didn't realize there was that much stuff going into AgDisc, so that's good. If anybody has any other questions later on, you can either email Brad or get in touch with Shar in the office. We definitely appreciate everybody coming on here today. Special thanks for Brad for your presentation again. We're hoping to try and continue these type of sessions. I think they're definitely good. We'll maybe try and get one set up this fall. If anybody has any, questions or suggestions for some material, definitely let us know. But we'll definitely try and set some more of these sessions up. I think it was great to see everybody here and great information for everybody. So.
Yeah, no, thank you. And like I said, if what I presented didn't really hit the mark because I was kind of shooting in the dark, let me know. And if there's anything that I can prepare and add, and if again anybody's got any questions on anything I could either answer or help find you an answer, please shoot me an email. I'm here and happy to help.
Okay, no, perfect. Thank you. Shar, do you have anything else to add for that?
No, thank you very much for attending, and thank you, Brad, for the presentation. Very much appreciate your time.
Yep. No, thank you all.
Okay, thanks everybody. Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks,
Bye,
CAAA,
everyone.
for the
Thank
invite.
you.
Much appreciated.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everybody.